The NFC West is expected to be a very top-heavy division, but will it be? The Niners have had a kind of a bad preseason training camp, if you will, in terms of news. We'll break down all four teams in the NFC West coming up next on the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Jeff Erickson here with Nick Whalen. Later in this podcast, you will hear about Nick's favorite player to draft this season. Maybe his most roster player. We'll see about that. League winner, maybe. We'll see. But we are going to break down the NFC West. Nick, we'll just jump right into it here. Alphabetically, we're going to go with the team that's projected to be last in the division, the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the Cardinals are projected last in this division speaks to the relative strength of the division, because there are a lot of people that are believers in not only Marvin Harrison and Kyler Murray, but this Arizona team taking a step forward this season. I think Arizona will certainly be competitive. I still think they are to me the fourth best team in the division. It kind of depends how you feel about teams like the Rams and the Seahawks. I choose to be pretty optimistic on the outlooks for both of those teams. I think this could be a 3 playoff team division. And in that scenario, Arizona's probably left out. They are 3-1 right now to make the playoffs. To give you some perspective on that, the New Orleans Saints are plus 170. The Minnesota Vikings are 3-1. The Raiders are 3-1. So I think it's less about the Cardinals and it's more about the upside of those other teams in the division. But plenty of fantasy appeal here with Arizona. And of course, it starts with Marvin Harrison.
Yeah. And I think you nailed it. There's plenty of fantasy appeal because I think we like the offense. I think there are things to like about this offense quite a bit. The defense might be tragic, but plenty of fantasy appeal. Marvin Harrison, generational receiver. We hear that generational term thrown around every 2 or 3 years now. So generations are shorter than they used to be.
Look, I love Marvin Harrison. I am really excited to see what he's going to be this year. I have very, very, very few shares of Marvin Harrison because of where he's drafted. And, we've gone over this on pods and on the radio and on Beeson. I think you're paying for the best case scenario. And is there a world in which, Marvin Harrison is drafted as the wide receiver 8 and he finishes as the wide receiver 4? Yeah, that's possible. But to me, that is like a, top 5% type of outcome and not something that I would necessarily bank on. I think if I'm taking one of the two, big time rookie receivers, I'm a little bit more comfortable going with Neighbors, but that's only because of the price. I think these guys are comparable as players. The situation for Harrison should be better in Arizona, but again, you look at the names that go ahead of him, and it's hard for me to say that there should only be like a 3 or 4 pick gap between he and Garrett Wilson. We've seen Justin Jefferson, we've seen Jamar Chase, we've seen Puka Nacua come in and have these elite seasons right away. I'm not saying it can't be done. But normally you don't have to draft those players where you get them, right? Like when Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, these guys were 6th, 7th, 8th round picks. And when they have that season, it's a huge boon to your fantasy team. You're getting first round value out of a mid-round pick. And with Harrison, if he has one of those seasons, that's great, but you're not getting that same level of value, of opportunity cost, if you will, if you're taking that guy with the 13th overall pick in your draft. So that's a zone where go ahead.
I think that Jefferson and Chase and Nacua ruined it for us in terms of Harrison, that we want the next one there. And, Harrison has been even compared superlatively to those guys coming into the draft is the interesting thing.
Yeah, I think so. To me, he's had the advantage of, kind of being that guy for an extra year. It's like even before he was draft eligible, we were talking about Marvin Harrison and, Jefferson and Chase, they were, big time recruits, not on the level of Harrison, but, guys who were on the radar, but it wasn't really until that last season at LSU where both of those guys took a huge leap. So I think that's part of it with Harrison, but I still, I don't think he's on like another tier from those guys in terms of their prospect pedigree. I think in terms of name value, maybe he is. I think it certainly helps that he is named Marvin Harrison, and his father was one of the most productive and consistent receivers of his generation. But again, the gap in terms of where you have to pay up for Marvin Harrison versus where you paid up for other similarly elite receiver prospects in the past, it's just too big for me to be willing to pay that price. And I'm not saying I'm super comfortable with, any of the receivers in that range. There's questions about Drake London. There's questions about Puka Nacua's health and the split with Cooper Kupp. The Saints offense overall with Chris Olave, Devontae Adams, and Gardner Minshew. It's like there's not, I get it because there's not really an obvious pivot there. But it's still, to me, it's just not a value proposition that I like.
Yeah, I hear you on that one there. I get it. And hey, all politics are local. And maybe in your league, Harrison, and some of the home leagues, he drops. Like we spent the NFC South podcast talking about how Drake London's getting pushed up. Joe in the comments says he got him with the 9th pick in round 5. That's amazing value for Drake London. I'm all over it there.
Yeah. I mean, if you're getting him, a good like 25 spots after ADP, then sure, absolutely. And it is important to note, we often reference NFFC ADP. It's going to look a lot different than your home league. My home league is like 90% Packers fans. So you just, an artificial bump for anybody who is either a current or former Packer. There are going to be
3rd round Jaden Reed. Yeah.
pockets in your league. It's not going to look exactly like this. You're not paying that exorbitant price for Harrison, in some more casual format. So I get that. Upside wise, again, it's there. It wouldn't be shocking if he had a Jamar Chase type of season. I just don't like going into a year feeling like I absolutely need that from a guy who's never played an NFL game, has never played in the NFL. We don't know for sure that Marvin Harrison is going to be that guy. We think he could be that guy. We think he's the right spot to be that guy. I'm not comfortable taking him that high.
For sure. And one of the reasons he goes so high too is the rest of the receiver room isn't especially accomplished. It's Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, Zay Jones is suspended for the start of the season. Not that I was super afraid of Zay Jones cutting into that volume, but you could just see, well, he's going to get 1 billion targets. Yeah, he might, but there's always somebody. I think that's the other thing to kind of bring up there. Trey McBride is that always somebody. He's the guy that's like tight end 3 now in most cases, maybe tight end 4. Jim Coventry's got him less than that. I just was listening to Jim and Alan driving home from Vegas yesterday doing the Sunday Sirius XM show. Where do you have Trey McBride among tight ends?
I don't have a whole lot of Trey McBride. I do think he is appropriately priced, as part of that top tier of tight ends. It took him a little bit to get going last season, but when you start to look at especially the second half of the year, I'm just pulling up week 9 and beyond. He was solidly inside that top 4, along with David Njoku, of course, Evan Ingram and Sam Laporta down the stretch. I haven't been going early tight end in too many drafts. I actually think the tight end position to me is similar to quarterback this year, and that's borne out in the ADPs. It's borne out in the way that the tiers break down. I've been getting a lot more Evan Ingram. I've been getting some Kyle Pitts. I've actually been getting more George Kittle lately because his price has fallen to a point that I feel like has become a pretty good value. And my most roster tight end is Jake Ferguson. So I'm usually not shopping in that top tier. I'm looking to grab, one of those 4 names in that second tier.
Yeah. Ferguson's my stopgap. He's like my, don't go past him. It's only happened once or twice, and I don't like the results when that happens. You talked about the quarterbacks. One of those quarterbacks that you can wait on a little bit is Kyler Murray. He enters the year healthy, kind of enters the year without any sort of controversy swirling around him like it has been in previous years. What's your level of optimism with Kyler Murray?
I'm optimistic. I think a lot of it is tied to Marvin Harrison, right? Where it's like, all right, we've given him this elite weapon, and not only is Marvin Harrison going where he is, but he's, I think, kind of pulling up Kyler Murray's ADP. And you look at once Kyler Murray was fully healthy and kind of back to being himself last season, was hovering around QB 9, QB 10, QB 11 range. On a per game basis, he was right in that same zone. Gave you about the same production as Matthew Stafford, Trevor Lawrence, and he's going above both of those guys by a pretty good margin right now. You're hoping for a little bit more rushing upside with Kyler Murray, of course. I think that's what separates him from a lot of those veteran quarterbacks who are more reliable as passers. I just, are we getting to the point with Kyler Murray where we start to slow down a little bit? They try to protect him. Obviously, he's coming off the injury. He's a smaller guy. That was something that was such a big part of his profile, coming out of college. But, as those type of quarterbacks get older and older, and I know Kyler Murray's not old, but as they get deeper into their career, you do typically see more of a protective element with those quarterbacks. I don't necessarily have a problem with the acquisition cost. QB9 feels about right. Kyler versus Dak is an interesting debate. I don't really have a ton of Dak. I really only have him on teams where I took CeeDee Lamb early on, and then I obviously want that connection, which was so fruitful last season. But Kyler Murray, I think for a lot of people, is maybe the end of a tier of comfortability, right? Because then you're getting into Jaden Daniels, and then you're getting into what feels like kind of a different category of quarterbacks with Brock Purdy, Caleb Williams, Tua, Jared Goff, et cetera. Some of these guys who, have high yardage potential, high touchdown potential, but don't have the same rushing upside as Kyler Murray.
Yeah, I think Kyler Murray is my Jake Ferguson at quarterback.
Okay.
I can wait even longer than that. I have gone with Daniels or Williams and pair him with a veteran like Lawrence later on. I think that's still a viable way to do that. I like that I'm calling Lawrence a veteran now, by the way. He's getting paid like one. So there is that. So I'm more inclined to wait at QB than I am at tight end. Like I could wait, and be okay. But I definitely think that there is a point of demarcation. You could make Dak that for you as well, and I'm fine with that. Although I'm just so worried about the Lamb situation now. Chase showed up to practice, Lamb hasn't yet. So that's one point of difference there. Running back. James Cook is always, not James Cook, I'm sorry. James Conner is always there for you. He's that guy, running back 18, and it's easy to get his backup too, and Trey Benson. I think that's one of the reasons, like, you compare that versus the Tennessee situation, compare that versus the Pittsburgh situation. Or Cleveland, like on Saturday, I got Chubb, but didn't get Ford. He went one pick later. The gap between the two is enough that you can afford both running backs. You get covered because I think Conner, when healthy, is fine. They do have a rookie running back in Benson that they like, but you can get them. You can afford to get both of them. If you like to handcuff your running backs, this is a very easily attainable one.
Yeah, and even the acquisition cost for Conner, I don't think is exorbitant, right? I think it actually makes a lot of sense that he's going at about the same pick as Aaron Jones. I view those two as pretty similar players, guys with similar levels of upside, but also players who always feel like they're on the verge of being banged up or are always playing through something, right? So I think there's a reason that James Conner isn't pushed up any further. I don't mind shopping for running back in that range. Kenneth Walker used to be in that range. He's now like a full round plus ahead, at least in the NFFC. You'll see James Conner go about 10 picks lower in ESPN right now than he does in the NFFC. You could get him, pretty comfortably in round 6, and sometimes even round 7. James Conner versus David Montgomery is a choice that I've had to make quite a bit. I usually lean on the safety of Montgomery. I'm looking for an RB2, maybe even an RB3 if I go early in a non PPR there. But beyond those three, Conner, Montgomery, and Jones, that's when you start to get into running backs with some more questions. You have a clear starter in Ramondre Stevenson, who might be in a terrible offense in New England. You got DeAndre Swift, who goes about 7-8 picks after James Conner. And, he's somebody that I think on the surface we like. He's in what should be a productive situation in Chicago, but always seems to find a way to kind of let us down in terms of, the actual numbers versus expectation. And then it's Zamir White, Najee Harris, Javonte Williams, guys like that. I have no problem with James Conner at all. I think he's actually, he's somebody I'm rarely willing to jump ADP for, although depending on where you are in a draft, sometimes you might have to, because there is, at least in the NFFC, there's a full round between James Conner and the running back who goes ahead of him in Alvin Kamara. So if you're kind of in that middle zone and you're picking like 56th overall and you're like, well, Conner usually goes later, but I really want a running back here, that's where I'm willing to take him. But again, I lean on the security of David Montgomery a bit more than I do Conner. How concerned are you, about the threat of Trey Benson, again, not overtaking James Conner, but encroaching on that role to the point where it's a diminishing return?
So where it becomes the dreaded timeshare, right? Yeah. A little bit. I think there's enough to go around, just because I don't know, but we'll see. I think this is a fast-paced team, and I think that's going to help both. Again, I don't think there's a ton of targets for Kyler, so I think maybe they'll even be involved in the passing game a little bit, so that helps. I think it's akin to Detroit. I think it's a cheaper version of Detroit, not as good. But I think it's one where both could be viable if it becomes more of a 1A, 1B sort of situation there, as opposed to a 1-2 situation. I like getting both of them there. I think that's one of the ones. Because I think Connor I think Connor is good enough that they trust him. The team was so much better when they had him healthy last year offensively. The defense is really awful on this team. Yep. Maybe one of the bottom 3 or 4 defenses in the league.
Yeah, we're obviously not overly concerned about that for fantasy. I think the way to spin that is, hey, maybe they'll be in a bunch of shootouts, right? And they'll have to throw the ball more, and they'll be a little bit more up tempo. But no, you're right. I mean, this is not a team with a ton of name value whatsoever. I mean, there's like only probably 2 or 3 players who the average NFL fan would be like, oh yes, that guy is on the Arizona Cardinals, and I know who that is. I mean, it's it's certainly a concern, in terms of real life, and especially with the teams in that division, right? I mean, you're bringing that defense to go play the 49ers twice. I think the Rams are salivating looking at the Arizona Cardinals secondary right now. And, I'm high on Seattle. So I think that does put Arizona in a dangerous spot. Again, you could spin it as somewhat of a positive for fantasy in that they're going to have to score to hang around in games, but it also puts a lot of pressure on your offense, man. So I'm obviously high on a lot of these pieces for fantasy. I'm not necessarily high on, Arizona being a team that could sneak its way into the playoffs. I think the division is too strong. I think they're a couple years, perhaps away from developing into that. But again, there's not many teams, even, especially a team in Arizona's position, to me, the clear fourth best team in their own division, where you have a top 10 quarterback, you have a running back who we feel good about in James Conner, you have a receiver who goes in the top 15 or 16, and you have one of the top 5 tight ends in football. So there is kind of a interesting dichotomy going on here. And before we move on from Arizona, the last thing I will say is I have a little interest in Michael Wilson late in draft. We saw some flashes. We saw some spike games from him at the end of the year. Obviously, bringing in Marvin Harrison, it kind of works against Wilson in some ways, but I like the physical profile of Wilson. I think he's a different enough player from Marvin Harrison. And, I think he's somebody that showed enough signs that if I'm just, throwing a dart, I mean, he goes in the 160s right now in the NFFC. He's even more affordable. Somebody you might not have to draft in your home league. You look at some of the other names in that mix, Demario Douglas, Quentin Johnston, Marvin Mims, guys like that. Give me a shot on Michael Wilson.
Good. I like that. I like that one. Over under is either 6.5 or 7.5 wins, depending where you go. We'll go DraftKings. There's 6.5 juice to the over at -150. What say you?
6.5, man. I'm trying to do like the mental math here. I think I have to go under. If I think Seattle's going to be good, if I think the Rams are going to be good, if I think the 49ers are going to continue to be the 49ers, then I have to take the under here. It could certainly see a world in which this is, the best division in football, top to bottom, and it's competitive all the way through. Right. But I think they're going to get beat up in division. I think they're going to be on the short end of most of those 6 divisional games. So I'll say this is a 6-11 team this year. We're taking the under.
I'm in lockstep with you on that one there. We'll talk a little LA Rams coming up next, but first, why wait all season to win in fantasy? With Verse Fantasy, you can cash in every week. Download the Verse app, sync your fantasy league, and start wagering and winning today. Verse Fantasy is the new way to play fantasy. There's no need to draft a new team or bring your league to a new platform. Simply sync your current league from ESPN, Sleeper, or Yahoo into the Verse Fantasy app and instantly get money lines and spreads for your league's matchups that week. Playing fantasy for fun is cool, but playing for real money is the future. Play for real money on your own underdog lines and place contests between primetime games to bet on your own comeback. Verse will even show you your odds for winning the title or being crowned the Sacco, every player's nightmare. Enter the arena this season with Verse Fantasy. Use promo code ROTO, that's ROTO, to get the 100% deposit match up to $50 when you sign up. The LA Rams are next for us here. This is a team that made the playoffs. They had the Lions also on the ropes for a while in their wild card game. There's a theme going on here with teams that we're talking about today, kind of similar to the Bucs. This is one of those teams where the front line optimism is strong, but it strikes me as not a super deep team.
Not a super deep team at all. Very top heavy, but I like the talent at the top. We love the coaching. We love the infrastructure that the Rams have built. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid on the LA Rams. And, I think if the 49ers do falter at any point, if they don't have the same health luck that they did last season, I mean, that was, somebody did the work on this. I forget whose name I should be shouting out here, but I know our guy Andrew Erickson cited it in one of his pieces at Fantasy Pros. The Niners had their healthiest season in 10 plus years last year in terms of, games lost. And those are, weighted toward the more important players. I think the Rams are the team that's next up. If the 49ers do take a step back, if they do end up trading Brandon Aiyuk, I think that's a big piece to try to replace on the fly. The offensive line for the Rams, that's where I have a lot of questions. We got injuries right now. Rob Havenstein's banged up. Jonah Jackson is banged up. Alaric Jackson is suspended for the first 2 games of the year. They have some more depth injuries on that offensive line. It was a line that actually played pretty well last season, all things considered, but I think we have some major question marks there. Obviously, you're trying to replace, a generational, arguably the best interior lineman of all time in Aaron Donald. Although I'm not 100% sure Aaron Donald doesn't show up, doesn't pull an Ndamukong Suh and rejoin this team at some point later in the year. I'm just saying, I'm just putting it out there. I would not be shocked if that happens. But I also think the Rams did what they could in the draft to go out and get Jared Verse, go out and get Braden Fisk, two guys out of Florida State, more so play on the outside, but at least just kind of bolster that defensive line and do what you can to replace Aaron Donald. The secondary always feels like it's a bit shaky for the Rams. They always feel kind of undersized at linebacker as well. I mean, this is not a perfect roster by any means. And I think the biggest red flag, if you're somebody who's skeptical of the Rams, is not only is it a top-heavy roster, but a lot of these guys at the top are injury prone, right? Starting with Cooper Kupp. Matthew Stafford is a guy who's been banged up, typically plays through it, but, affects the way he plays. Kyren Williams missed time last season. They did bring in some insurance in Blake Corum. But where do you want to start here? You want to go receivers first? You want to talk Stafford?
Let's talk receivers here. So we got, Puka Nacua is dealing with a little bursa sack issue, as it has been so lovingly claimed. Cooper Kupp is fully healthy now. There's some talk about him never being fully healthy last year. We're seeing the ADPs of those two receivers converge. Nacua previously was drafted late first round, early second. Yep. Now it's like early to mid second round, and Kupp's like late second now as opposed to third round.
Yeah, I mean, Cooper Kupp rising, that one to me, it was predictable, but I didn't know if he would get quite to this level. I mean, he's really going right at the end of the second round right now, and I'm trying to grab a comparison from a couple of months ago. So right now, his average pick is about 24 in the NFFC. If you rewind all the way back to early June, his ADP was about 40. So, I mean, he has risen a full round and a half, and you would see, Cooper Kupp go in the 50s in some drafts back in June. I mean, that is just not happening anymore. And, I was getting a ton of Cooper Kupp, especially early in best ball season. I've had to slow my roll a little bit, given the level of investment now, just because of the injury risk. Cooper Kupp being the wide receiver 13 right now, it's like he could still beat that. No question. He's done it before. But, realistically, what is the chance that he makes it through this season without a major injury? It gives you 16 or 17 games. It's possible. I hope that's what happens, but you have to acknowledge the risk here. My question to you is, even at the updated ADP, are you willing to jump that? Are you willing to, let's say you're picking 19th. Are you taking him over Devontae Adams? Would you take him over Chris Olave?
I wouldn't take him over Mike Evans. I think that's my thing. Well, tell me this. Who's older, Mike Evans or Cooper Kupp?
I don't have this information in front of me. It has to be close. I'll say Kupp. I think the way you're
Kupp
asking
by
it
a couple of
implies
months.
Kupp. Okay, yeah.
Kupp by a couple of months. Kupp has that 1,900-yard season. He has two 1,000-yard seasons.
Yeah.
Evans has all 1,000-yard seasons.
Yeah.
Second round is more floor for me than it is for ceiling.
Okay.
And say what you will. I mean, Kupp is healthy now. He could be amazing, but he could also drop off. He could get hurt again just as easily. He's the guy that's had the soft tissue injuries. Yep. It's interesting to me that everyone says, "Oh, why I'm worried about Evans being old." Well, Kupp's older.
Yeah,
Kupp is slightly older and has been injured more. I just think it's interesting to see that dichotomy. Just because Evans has been in the league longer, he came into the league, at a younger age, but that doesn't, it's just because Kupp was bouncing between colleges. That's all. That's the
no, you're right. You're right. And, I think there's a reason that they're only separated by 3 or 4 spots in ADP right now. It's, I mean, it's obvious analysis, but I was a lot more comfortable, making the decision of, all right, Cooper Kupp or Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp or T Higgins than I am now with some of the other names that he's up there with.
Yeah.
I mean, are you going Nico over him? Are you taking Waddle over him?
Nico, yes. Waddle, no.
Okay.
Right. But I'm also kind of higher man on Nico than most too. So for whatever that's worth. Waddle, I have my own. He's always seems to be nicked up in some way, shape, or form, and he's not the number one on his team. Whereas Kupp probably, it's Kupp and Nacua are like 1 and 1A. Waddle is clearly 2 on his team.
Mm-hmm.
I think Nico is kind of 1 on his team, although we'll see with Diggs. We haven't seen that. We haven't seen how it's going to play out with the 3 of them. Houston, I probably should be lower on Nico than I am because there's 3 mouths to feed.
Right.
But that's now we're getting into AFC South zone again here, and we started there, so we'll move on from that. But I don't have a whole lot of Nacua this year. To my, I'm a little worried about that because I didn't have him last year, and it wasn't because I doubted. I didn't buy in enough. Like I wanted to get there, but I just thought I could get him at a more affordable price, and I couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's also important to remember, how much differently we viewed Puka Nacua on August 26, 2023 versus August 26 of 2024, right? I mean, I don't think anybody was, claiming banging the table that you absolutely need to draft Puka Nacua late in draft. Some people were, and credit to them.
Right.
It was more likely in most leagues that you picked him up on waivers early in the year. And, when you have a massive bounce in expectations year over year, I think it takes your mind a little bit of time to adjust. Right. And, somebody that doesn't have the Marvin Harrison pedigree coming in, I think it's natural to think, all right, I want to see it again before I fully buy in. Nacua, we only have 1 year of sample, obviously. So we can't play the Mike Evans game. We can't play the Cooper Kupp game. It's hard to project, where his health is going to be, where his production is going to be when you're only dealing with a small sample. Part of Cooper Kupp rising has been Nacua falling a bit. You're no longer seeing Puka Nacua go in round 1 like we were, a month or two ago. Every now and then it'll still be the 11th or the 12th pick. But I'm more comfortable taking him in this range. We're now making the Nacua versus London, Nacua versus Olave, Nacua versus Adams debate, as opposed to Puka Nacua versus Justin Jefferson or AJ Brown or even Garrett Wilson.
Yeah, exactly right. So I think it's an interesting it's an interesting comp on the decisions that we have to make as far as that goes. Running back, okay, obviously we've got Kyren Williams, who, if it wasn't Nacua that won you your league, it was Kyren Williams that won you your league last year. Lots of injury concern with him. Lots of concern about playing time because Blake Corum just got drafted by them in the 3rd round. Let's just talk about both of these guys.
Yeah, I think Kyren Williams again is probably appropriately priced based on last season. There's been a healthy degree of skepticism, I think, since the Blake Corum pick was made. You do worry about the level of workload, similar to what we talked about in the NFC South pod with Rachaad White. I mean, you look at how Kyren Williams ended the year after coming back from injury: 21, 25, 27, 22, 20 carries, in 5 straight games to end his regular season. He didn't play in week 18. It's not what the Rams want, right? I mean, Kyren Williams is to me the better back than Blake Corum at this point. I don't think Blake Corum takes this job from Kyren Williams. But almost every backfield in the NFL, you want to have that reliable second option. I mean, it's just the days of Larry Johnson, carrying the ball 28 times a game. This doesn't happen anymore, right? They didn't draft Blake Corum because they don't like Kyren Williams and they don't want him to be a part of this offense. They drafted Blake Corum so they don't have to run Kyren Williams into the ground with no other option. So I just think there's not quite as much upside this season because they're going to mix Blake Corum in. And part of it's preservation of Kyren Williams. Again, it's not because they don't think Kyren Williams is a good player. It's that they want Kyren Williams to be able to make it through the season. And part of that is sacrificing some week-to-week upside. And hopefully the trade-off is that he doesn't miss 4 games.
Indeed. I think you're right about that there. There is some concern that, hey, when McVay finds a back, though, he just turns to him a lot, too. So that's maybe why I think some people are concerned.
Yeah, no, for sure. I get that. And, he has played favorites. I've been loading up on Blake Corum late in drafts. I think he still goes late enough that, certainly if you take Kyren Williams early and you want to play the handcuff game, it's affordable, right? Similar to what we talked about with Trey Benson. You have to pay a little bit higher of a price for Corum, but, still going around pick 120 in the NFFC. You look at some of the other backs that are in that range, and it's either guys who are for sure in a true timeshare. It's somebody like Nick Chubb coming off of an injury. It's Rico Dowdle and Ezekiel Elliott. It's the Chargers backs. I think he's going about where he should. But again, I would be very surprised if Blake Corum, even if this gets to like a 60-40 split, like I still think it's Kyren Williams' job. You just have to acknowledge that, the week-to-week 20, 25 carry games, if I'm the Rams, I don't want that happening, and I think that's a big part of the reason you make that investment in Corum.
Yep. How are you clicking on Matthew Stafford as your personal QB too often?
Sometimes, as somebody who waits on quarterback, I'll often just kind of double up on a couple of those guys. I've been getting a little bit more Jaden Daniels lately, and I usually like to, back him up with what I view as a reliable option. I don't really have a problem with Tua where he's going. I'm not the biggest Tua guy, but we're ultimately talking about the QB 14, and if he can stay healthy again, I think he has a pretty good chance to beat that. But again, a little bit more Jared Goff than Stafford, but getting some Trevor Lawrence, but. I mean, really, I like a lot of the options in that range. I've talked a lot about the opportunity cost equation when it comes to quarterback. I don't love taking an early quarterback. Maybe I'll shop in the Love, Murray, Dak, Daniels range, but I'm totally okay in a lot of leagues going in with like Goff and Stafford, Lawrence and Stafford as my 2 quarterbacks.
All right. Over under on the Rams, either 8.5 at DraftKings and Bet Rivers, 9.5 at FanDuel and BetMGM. I know you're bullish on the Rams. How bullish are you?
I'm bullish enough to go over on either of those numbers. I think this team wins double-digit games. Obviously, it's very health dependent, and I think if they could stay relatively healthy, it's a pretty easy over for me, to be honest. But the number sits where it is because I think we all acknowledge that risk. Schedule-wise, they're right in the middle of the pack in terms of Warren Sharp's, preseason schedule rankings. Tough schedule in division, no question. Not the easiest out of division schedule. They do have to play the AFC East. That means you're going to the New York Jets. You do get the Dolphins at home in November, which, is good and bad, right? That's actually a pretty decent spot, I think, for the Dolphins playing indoors that time of year. And you do get the Bills at home late in the season as well. So it's by no means an easy schedule, but I think it's manageable for the Rams. And again, if this team has just decent health luck, I think they could be a 10, 11 win team. No question.
The favorite in the division is the San Francisco 49ers. We're going to talk about them next. But first, quick note from our friends at Fantasy Sports Knockout. Fantasy Sports Knockout, where a fantasy league meets a knockout pool. An innovative take on fantasy football. The concept is simple. Choose a new fantasy lineup each week and score points in the same way you would in any fantasy league. But you must choose your players wisely. You can only use each player one time. The lowest weekly score or group of scores is eliminated from the contest every week. The concept may be simple, but survival is not. How will you play? Load up early or play the matchups and save the better players for later? Fantasy Sports Knockout. Can you survive the fantasy? Sign up at play.fantasysportsknockout.com today. We're also on the Blue Wire Network. Here are their ads. All right, there we go. The San Francisco 49ers are clear win now type of mode. They're tied with the Chiefs for the highest over under on win totals. They're the favorite to come out of the NFC. But there's also been a little bit of a hangover effect from losing the Super Bowl this past year.
Yeah, and you kind of just wonder, is San Francisco running out of premium chances, right? I mean, is that window close to closing? And I don't think it's closed this season by any means, of course. I mean, this might be their last best chance, I think, with this core. Especially if you factor in what I mentioned earlier with the health. Can they be as healthy as they were last season? Can you expect Christian McCaffrey to give you 16 healthy games as he did a year ago? Obviously, they didn't play him in Week 18 against the Rams. Last year was a best case scenario for McCaffrey in a number of ways, and I think if you told me what player in the league is going to lap the field at his position and put up 100 more fantasy points than anybody else, it would be Christian McCaffrey. But it's been over a decade since we've had a running back finish as the RB1 in PPR leagues in back-to-back years. And again, if anybody could do it, it's Christian McCaffrey. But history, tends to dictate with that position that it's very, very hard to have, back-to-back big-time elite seasons like McCaffrey did. He's dealing with the injury. They have some other injuries, all over this roster. They have the Brandon Aiyuk situation, the Trent Williams situation. Brock Purdy's contract is coming around at some point, and this could very well be the last season that Deebo Samuel is on this roster. On the defensive side of the ball, you're bringing back Talanoa Hufanga, which is huge. Probably going to begin the season on IR. But getting him back, I think, is kind of somebody that we forgot about, toward the end of last year, how important he is. But you're also, going to be without Dre Greenlaw, likely for a good chunk, if not the entire regular season, right? A guy who suffered a very serious injury in the Super Bowl. So yeah, I think there are certainly more questions than you would like for this 49ers team, that when healthy and when everybody is signed to an NFL contract, I think this is the best roster in football, and it might not be all that close. But yeah, it does feel like there are more questions and a little bit more doubt around some of these key players than there should be right now.
Yeah. And I can't help but remember all the, with Nick Bosa and without Nick Bosa splits for this defense as well. He's healthy now, at least. So there's that. Health was one of those big things. That was really cool. Let's go back to McCaffrey though. Let's start right off the top. He's got he's ramping up his activity level. We saw this as an update last week, I think. He's practicing on the side with that calf. This struck me as a bit of extra precaution, and yet it's a soft tissue injury, and it's got me a little scared with the 1.1. Are you still clicking on him at 1.1 if you get that?
If I have the 1.1, I'm still taking him. I don't really want the 1.1 at this point. It's not devastating, but I don't really want it, especially if you're in a third round reversal league. I think that puts you behind the 8 ball to the point where I'd rather just pick in the middle or even closer to the end of round 1. That 5 through 8 range is really my preference. But a big part of the reason why I'm still taking him is CeeDee Lamb, is at odds with the Dallas Cowboys, and the season starts in 10 days. I'm okay taking Tyreek Hill at 1. In some formats, I'm okay with Breece Hall or Bijan Robinson. Yeah, we've actually seen Amon-Ra St. Brown go number 1 in a couple of NFCs just in the last week, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But it's certainly not as much of a slam dunk with McCaffrey as it was a month ago. And I'm not really concerned about him missing week 1. It's more about, okay, is this a calf injury that lingers or, kind of reasserts itself at some point later in the year, right? Almost like what we went through with Joe Burrow last year, where it's like, is he out there for week 1? Yes, I think he is. But is it something where they have to exercise some caution, something that continues to bother him throughout the year, something that could lead to another injury later in the season? So I'm still taking him 1-1, but I'm not, it's not just the, all right, click on him and select your pick 1 second in and just sit back like it was a month ago.
No, it clearly isn't. Yeah, but hey, maybe that makes it for a buying opportunity. Maybe if you've got the 2 or 3 and you get them a little bit of discount, get a better guy and then really back, hey, maybe it's a win for you there too. We'll see. Brandon Aiyuk still holding out, though he did travel with the team for their final preseason game, maybe because it was in Vegas. I don't know. Maybe that had something to do with it there. But much like when I was encouraged by Jamar Chase hanging out on the sideline during the Bengals last preseason game, this is slightly encouraging for me to see that he at least was present, even if he wasn't participating.
It's really, we're grasping at straws with Aiyuk, man. I thought, once the talks with the Steelers cooled off, that I thought by now we would have a new deal in place for Brandon Aiyuk with the Niners, and we don't. And I don't think he's going to play for this team unless that deal comes. And we're running out of time here. The Commanders Jahan Dotson trade, adding some more assets, to me, that's something to at least monitor. Is that, the kind of the fuel for reigniting talks between those teams? Who knows? But as we get closer and closer to week 1, you have to be concerned. And I think there's some amount of hubris here on the 49ers side of things where they don't seem to be all that urgent. They don't seem to be all that concerned. And, would they be willing to take this into the regular season? Maybe. The Niners are a team unlike Dallas with CeeDee Lamb, where there's enough talent on this roster that they probably think they could survive. If we're talking, I don't know, 3-4 games to begin the year with Brandon Aiyuk, you could survive without him. But can you win the Super Bowl without him? I don't know if you can. They couldn't do it last year with almost perfect health on that offense. And, I think if this really turns sour and they end up trading him for a package that maybe they don't feel great about, it's a clear downgrade in the short term for the 49ers. And it's part of this is just the curse that you kind of inherit when you have so many good players that you eventually need to pay.
Yeah, exactly right. In a cap world, that's absolutely true. Have you moved Deebo Samuel up at all? Have you moved Aiyuk down? I personally am willing now to draft Deebo in the mid-3rd.
It totally depends what you think happens with Aiyuk, right? I mean, yeah. I would happily maybe pay up a little bit for Deebo Samuel if I think Brandon Aiyuk is traded, or if that deal goes down today and I'm doing a draft on Wednesday like I am for my NFC, then yeah, Deebo Samuel becomes super appealing. But I'm a little iffy on paying, what sometimes a late second round cost for Deebo. I mean, his ADP is like 26 right now at the NFFC. If they get the Aiyuk thing figured out, all of a sudden it feels like you're maybe taking a loss on that. And the thing with Deebo is just the health, right? I mean, I think even last season when he stayed relatively healthy, if you took him with the 30th pick in your draft, you were okay with it. But the amount of hits that guy takes, the way he's used, the amount of weapons that they have on this offense, they don't need as much out of Deebo Samuel being the gadgety player that he was before Christian McCaffrey showed up. I'm not necessarily thrilled, paying a mid-20s overall price for Deebo Samuel unless Brandon Aiyuk ends up being traded. For now, that's a little bit too high to me.
Yeah, I got Deebo at 3.7. So that's roughly like pick 31, I think, is where I got him. And again, it felt slightly uncomfortable. My draft was a little weird. I got these veteran wide receivers. I went Evans, Deebo, and Diggs in this draft. It's like team old, but it's team floor is the way I kind of looked at it there. But Deebo being described as a floor player is also kind of weird. So maybe I'm a little off on that one there. We'll see about that. George Kittle, you talked about it earlier. He's one of the guys that you're frequently getting at tight end because you feel like you're comfortable in that range. And I'm with you on that. I like him. I like Pitts and I like Ingram all in that tier.
Yeah, I think, George Kittle name value wise, I think has as much cachet, if not more than those other guys. And there is a trickle down effect here too. If Brandon Aiyuk ends up being moved, not only do you feel better about Deebo, you probably feel better about George Kittle as well. We saw Kittle really turn it on, kind of midway through last season, was able to sustain that toward the end of the regular season. Got off to a bit of a rough start. I mean, he had some single-digit weeks early on at the big game in week 5, but other than that, it was a little choppy. He finished as the wide receiver 5 in terms of total value. Didn't miss much time last year. That's kind of always one of the biggest things with Kittle. The way he plays, much like Deebo, is, inherently a little bit more risky than your average tight end. But we're talking about the tight end 8 here. And, I think I'd rather get Jake Ferguson around later, but it's also a little bit dangerous going into a draft saying I need to get this tight end who might not be available realistically to me until like the 6th or 7th round. Like, I don't want to take Jake Ferguson, at pick 55 just because I feel like I need him. And if you miss out on Jake Ferguson, then you're into a bit of an uncomfortable tier of tight end. So I like to have those two as options, and, kind of whichever feels like the better value at the time. That's where I've been leaning. But I think George Kittle, going essentially a full round after Kyle Pitts, going like 2 rounds after Mark Andrews, that to me could end up looking like a bargain more so than some of those other higher drafted tight ends.
Yeah, it could. It very well could be the case there. Brock Purdy, this is last year rookie contract for him. And this is some of the thing that's kind of driving the whole Aiyuk talk, is they have to pay Purdy at some point in time too. From a fantasy perspective though, he's got all these weapons at his disposal. He's not a runner. There's still some debate on how much of it's him and how much of it's the players around him. Yeah. Does that matter so much from a fantasy perspective? Can we still, I still think he's like a on the edge fantasy starter.
I'm okay with Brock Purdy as my QB1, but if I'm taking him there, then I'm also grabbing someone else, a couple rounds later, whether that's some of those names we mentioned, Tua, Goff, Lawrence, Cousins, Stafford, whoever it is. Like, I still want to insulate myself, whereas if I guess the thing is there are so many viable quarterbacks right now that even if you go early QB and Josh Allen, like you're still getting somebody that you feel pretty good about backing him up with. You're not going to back up Josh Allen with Kyler Murray or Dak or even Brock Purdy, but you can still wait 3 rounds later and get one of those names that I mentioned. Aaron Rodgers is kind of the last point of demarcation for me. And if you're in a 6-point per touchdown league, I think that could be pretty viable. Purdy, I think we're being realistic here because he was the QB6 last season, and he's now being drafted as the QB12 at the NFFC. So that there is some upward mobility there, but if you look into some of the metrics on Purdy, he was closer to the QB8, QB9 in terms of per game production last year. Our guy, Andrew Erickson, who I mentioned earlier for Fantasy Pros, he wrote a great piece after the season on Brock Purdy and mentioned that he led all quarterbacks in fantasy points above expectation last season. He threw significantly more touchdowns than expected and was still the QB8. And this, again, goes back to him staying healthy, the Niners staying healthier than they've been in a decade, Kittle, Deebo, McCaffrey, all those guys staying healthy. Like, if some of these other pieces in the Niners offense start to crumble, or if he loses Brandon Aiyuk, all of a sudden, that room for upward mobility to me starts to feel a little bit cramped. So I'm ultimately okay drafting Brock Purdy. I'm not really going into a draft saying I really want him. If you get George Kittle or Aiyuk or Deebo earlier in the draft, or even McCaffrey, that makes him more appealing. But when I wait on quarterback, Jeff, I tend to really wait, and I don't really want to take Brock Purdy around pick 100. I would rather, take a couple spec ads on receivers or running backs in that range, and move a little bit further into Goff, Lawrence, Cousins territory.
Yeah, I can see it. There. Obviously Lawrence, I think the consensus on him is shaping to be a little bit more positive. Maybe we have a little bit of recency bias in his last preseason game, which is kind of crazy that we're basing on preseason against a set of backups. But I also get it though too, so it's kind of funny.
Last thing I'll say on that, the difference between Purdy and Lawrence last year was like 30 total fantasy points. And we're talking 2 to 3 rounds sometimes between those guys. So it really depends how you feel about that 100 to 120 range. Are there running backs you like there? Is there a tight end you like there? Is there a receiver you feel like you have to get? If not, Brock Purdy to me presents a higher floor than Trevor Lawrence, but I don't think you're sacrificing all that much for a chance to bolster your skill players and still get a pretty good quarterback.
I think you're right about that. I think you make a great point. Joe asked, do I dare trade CMC for Breece Hall in my keeper league? Presuming that, obviously you're going to keep Hall for a couple extra years. That's the reason for doing it there. Team's already good, looking to repeat.
If your primary goal is repeating, I still think there's more upside with Christian McCaffrey this year, but it's not a huge step down for me from McCaffrey to Breece Hall. And if you're trying to thread the needle and both compete this year and maintain a little bit more viability 2, 3, 4 years down the road, then obviously Breece Hall is the more appealing option. I guess the other way to look at it with Hall is, we might like him this year with Aaron Rodgers in place, but what if Aaron Rodgers is done after the season? Are we back to purgatory when it comes to the Jets offense? I don't know.
Yeah. Over under on 11.5 wins for you on the Niners.
I think I'm a little bit lower than market on the Niners, but I still think there's so much talent on this team. They should be able to get to 12 wins. You look at the schedule, they're right in the middle of the pack. It's not an overly difficult schedule, despite being a first place schedule. I think they probably lose, a little bit in the division compared to last season, but I can't go under on the Niners. I got to take the over.
All right. I got a negative vibe. I'm going to say 11-6 is what they're going to end up as.
Okay.
So,
which is, if that's your floor, that's a hell of a year.
Yeah. It's probably a no action for me is what
Sure.
if I'm in a pool where I have to pick every over under, then I'd probably pick the under, but I wouldn't bet it. NFC champion, they are the odds on favorite plus 250. Lions are plus 550. Eagles are plus 600. Cowboys and Packers are next. Super Bowl odds are second only behind the Chiefs, and it's pretty close, 550 versus 600. Kind of surprised the Chiefs don't get a little bit more clearance, to be honest.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, I think part of it is playing in the AFC, just projects to be a deeper field and perhaps a more difficult road to the Super Bowl. Part of it is, it's just been forever since like trying to three-peat is just extremely difficult. And I don't know how much that's factored into the odds, but if you kind of view it as like, all right, what are the chances that a team like you parlay like 3 Super Bowls in a row? It's just an unlikely event historically. But I think the Chiefs should be favored. I mean, they're the only team that it feels like even when they're not playing their best or when they're outmatched in terms of a roster, like they were in the Super Bowl, I think the 49ers had the better team, no question, but you're not going to bet against the Chiefs. I mean, there's just something unquantifiable about going up against Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid and Travis Kelce and Chris Jones in a winner go home scenario. The Chiefs very rarely come up short in those situations, but I think most of it is just the strength of the AFC relative to the NFC. I think there's still questions about the viability of Detroit. Obviously there's questions around Philly as well. And if those are the other top 2 contenders in the NFC, you contrast that to the Ravens, the Bengals, the Texans, the Bills. It's just a more difficult road in the AFC.
Agreed. That I think that does factor into those overall odds. I think you're absolutely right about that. All right, we got one more team left to talk about, the Seattle Seahawks. But first, we got to share a quick note from you from our friends at Fantrax. Is there something you wish your fantasy league had or features that are missing from your current leagues? Bonus scoring, custom schedules or playoffs, deeper team settings? Well, look no further because we have you covered with our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Fantrax even offers college fantasy football leagues. Create or join a fantasy commissioner league, invite your friends, and dominate your draft this season. Fantrax is the top dynasty fantasy football platform in the industry. Coming from another service, not a problem. Fantrax can easily import any of your current leagues and rosters. Ever have a trade go wrong? Make a mistake in dropping a player? Fantrax Commissioner tools allow you to undo any move with one simple click. Fantrax is running a special promotion you don't want to miss. Sign up for free at fantrax.com/rotowire today to enter for your chance to win tickets to any regular season NFL game for you and your entire league. Plus $6,000 in spending cash. That's right. Tickets for your entire league. Simply create a new league or bring over your existing leagues for more chances to win. Go to fantrax.com/rotowire and sign up today. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. It's Seahawks time. They have a new head coach. They have a new coordinator. It's pretty much the same offensive personnel, but it's year 2 of some young players getting that second year. And in the case of Jaxon Smith-Njigba, Zach Charbonnet, their core players are still pretty young all around.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated and excited about the Seattle team this season. And, obviously Pete Carroll had brought more stability than this franchise had ever had over the last decade. But I think it felt like it was universally time to move on in terms of, Pete Carroll, I think not necessarily maximizing the talent on this roster. And, we're ultimately talking about a Geno Smith quarterback team. And I think this has gone about as well as it could, considering, where we kind of thought this team might go after parting ways with Russell Wilson. And that was clearly the right decision to get off of him at that time. You bring in a new, completely new head coach coming over from Baltimore. You got to like the pedigree there, new offensive coordinator and Ryan Grubb. The Seahawks want to play faster. The Seahawks have played faster in the preseason. I know it's only the preseason, but we have a limited sample to work from. I think this is a really, really exciting team. I'm all in on Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Even with his ADP rising, I still think he's one of the best values on the board. I think you're basically drafting him at his floor from last season. He's still going as the wide receiver 40 right now. And he was inside the top 40 in terms of wide receiver rankings, from like week 6 on last season. They were a little bit slow to work him into the mix. They were, undyingly loyal to Tyler Lockett, who I thought took a big step back behind the scenes last year. When you look at some of the advanced numbers, obviously they have DK Metcalf as well. And I don't think Jaxon Smith-Njigba overtakes Metcalf as the true alpha in that receiving core, but there's enough to go around here where I think he can be a really, really high level number 2. And I really think, Jeff, there's a world in which we kind of look at him closer to the Jalen Waddle type of tier, maybe closer to Devontae Smith, right? Or T. Higgins, where we say, all right, he's not the alpha on his own team, but he is one of the best number 2 receivers in the NFL and could be a number 1 for a lot of teams in the league right now. So JSN coming off the board as a wide receiver 40. I'll happily click on him over Christian Watson, over Deontay Johnson, over Xavier Worthy, even over Keenan Allen, who goes about a round ahead of him.
Yeah. I might have been a little hyperbolic in titling this league winner. I do that for my buddy Alan Sislowski. He loves big titles like that.
Now, hold on a moment, Jeff. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm reading from an Ian Rappaport tweet. The Cowboys and all-pro wide receiver CeeDee Lamb have agreed on a massive 4-year extension worth $136 million. Lamb gets $100 million guaranteed and a wide receiver record $38 million signing bonus. There we have it. CeeDee Lamb is back.
Yeah, Lamb is back. Does that mean Chase is far behind? I guess my concerns about voice.
We immediately go to the Bengals.
Yeah, yeah. But we could go to Aiyuk too while we're at it there. But because that sets the market again. Every player sets the market. First is Jefferson, now it's Lamb. The chance to buy the dip is gone, right?
Well, I think maybe a better way to, or maybe not a better way, a different way to frame this is going back to the Christian McCaffrey discussion. If you have the 1-1, do you now feel better about CeeDee Lamb? Does this make it tougher to take Christian McCaffrey 1-1?
Maybe it does. It just, any league where you got Lamb at 5, you're like, I'm happy now. But yeah, absolutely.
It makes me feel better about Dak as well. No question.
Yeah. I think so. Absolutely. Well, and again, there are occasions where holdouts last into the season, but I think we do this annual freak out because of what happened one time with Le'Veon Bell. And now we think that every holdout is scary, but
look, I'm here to offer comfort. It is scary. All right. If you drafted CeeDee Lamb 1-1 a few weeks ago, like you were panicking. You were absolutely panicking, but turned out it was all for naught. CeeDee Lamb will be out there. We're back.
Yeah, we are back. So good news there. Going back to your JSN. Well, we kind of covered him, so let's move on from that too. But yeah, CeeDee Lamb has signed. CeeDee Lamb has signed. Let's go back to let's go to DK Metcalf here for a little bit there. DK Metcalf, I think people expected him to be in that universe of wide receivers that was ultimately a first-round receiver, and it's never really quite happened. I think keep on thinking like, oh, yeah, this is the year he really breaks out. We'll take the shackles off this offense. And it hasn't really happened. He's still really good. And now I'm seeing some positive buzz. I'm seeing some leagues where he's going late second, early third. I did the host league on SiriusXM Fantasy last week where Ray Flowers took him at 211. So there are places now where his price has gone up.
Yeah, well, and what I've noticed is the people like me who are really in on the Seahawks, they're not afraid to draft that way, right? And you'll see, jumps in ADP for JSN, for DK Metcalf, even for Kenneth Walker, who's been a big riser over the last couple of weeks. Metcalf finished as the wide receiver 21 last year in PPR. He's going off the board in the NFFC as the wide receiver 21, which feels appropriate. I think there is some room for him to climb this year. Again, Seattle was dead last in pace of play last year. You look at Metcalf's week-to-week production, and he had a couple big time weeks, right? He had like a 37-point week later in the year, but also had a couple single-digit weeks. There were some weeks where it just felt like he was not nearly as involved as he should be. So I don't know if that necessarily changes. Maybe that's what separates DK Metcalf from that next tier of receivers is just the week-to-week consistency. But DK Metcalf being like the 15th to 20th best receiver in the NFL, that feels low based on his name value, but it also just speaks to how much talent there is at the position. It's like it's easy to say, oh man, that's way too low. And it's like, all right, well, look at the receivers going ahead of him. Like, how many of those guys would you say are legitimately worse than DK Metcalf? There's just a talent boom at receiver. That's part of it.
Yeah, agreed. Totally agree with you on that there too. So yeah, I still want. I don't have as much Metcalf as I'd like. I feel like I should probably have more of him there in that third round, but maybe that's the point is you're not getting him in that third round anymore.
Well, I like that group of receivers in general. It's like I think I'm not in on Pittman. I don't have a ton of neighbors, but DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, Devontae Smith, Brandon Aiyuk going at the end of round 3, even Stephon Diggs, Rashee Rice, T Higgins, guys who go in the mid to late 40s. That's a pretty fun tier of receiver to draft from. Like, I don't feel like there are a lot of clear misses there.
Yeah. Agreed. Metcalf went at 3-1 in my draft on Saturday night. I was hoping to get in the middle of the third round. It's interesting to see who's available to me and who's not. And then that's one that's a little bit unfortunate. I would have loved to have plucked that one there. So yeah, I like that range as well, though. I agree with you quite a bit. Running back, Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet. Walker is still the incumbent. I think people want to push Charbonnet up a little bit more, but Walker's not old. That's the problem with that combination.
No, it's an interesting combination because they both have, essentially the same draft capital. They were taken in back-to-back years. And, I think when Charbonnet came off the board last year, it was almost this, wait a second, Nick, didn't you just take a running back? It's like, do you not feel comfortable with him? I mean, it's similar in some ways to like Michael Mayer and Brock Bowers in Vegas. And much like what the Raiders are going to do, I think we're going to see both of Walker and Charbonnet. I like Kenneth Walker, the player. I do think he's risen to a point where I'm starting to back off a little bit. His ADP is now inside the top 50. Like we were talking earlier, I'd rather wait another round or two and just take James Conner, take David Montgomery, reluctantly take Ramondre Stevenson. But I still think Charbonnet is going a little bit too late. I mean, he goes outside of the top 130. He's basically the same ADP as Jalen Wright, who to me is, pretty clearly still the RB3 for the Miami Dolphins. There's a lot of upside in that offense, of course, but I think I view Zach Charbonnet as, yes, he's an RB2, but he's one of the higher end RB2s in the league. Like he's more of I could see this being like a 65-35, 60-40 type of split, as opposed to, 75-25, where there's a clear gap between those two. And I think this offense is going to be different and dynamic enough where there's room for both. You don't need to feel like there's a true feature back and Charbonnet just mixes in every now and then. I think they want to use both of those guys. So if I'm obviously you're not drafting Zach Charbonnet to start for you, but if I'm looking for RB depth, somebody that I think I could plug and play later in the year, obviously if Kenneth Walker goes down, there's a very clear path to Charbonnet being an RB1 for that team. For a guy who's the RB45 right now, I think he's a really nice value. He's going 4 spots ahead of Ty Chandler, for crying out loud.
Yeah. I 100% agree with you on that one there. I've gotten a lot of Charbonnet late. Geno Smith. Nobody really talks about him as like a plus guy, someone that we're excited about, but yet positive talk about DK Metcalf, JSN love all over the place. Even positive talk about Noah Fant. And we're talking about a faster pace. Is it possible we're overlooking Smith as a fantasy option?
To some degree. I mean, he's the QB 23. So, even if you're a little bit more optimistic on him than consensus, like he's not your QB 1 in just about any league. He might be the last guy that I'm really comfortable with as my QB 2, or certainly in a, QB 2 in a super flex. Depends how you feel about Will Levis, who goes right around that same range. I'm not as optimistic on Levis, although I do acknowledge that there is a bad season, good fantasy stats outcome for Levis and the Titans this year. But like Geno Smith versus Baker Mayfield, I think is a debate. I would consider Geno Smith over Baker. I'm not in on Deshaun Watson, who goes, well ahead of Geno Smith. And I think you're right to say that if we think DK Metcalf can outperform his ADP, if I think JSN can smash his ADP, if I think both Walker and Charbonnet are viable, I can't sit here and say that I'm out on Geno Smith. So there's obviously a ceiling here. He is still Geno Smith. There's a ton of talent at the quarterback position. You shouldn't be taking him, higher than a lot of those other veteran names that we mentioned. But as far as a guy who you can get for free, even at the end of an NFFC draft, if you really want to wait on quarterback, if you want to just, fire darts at skill position players and take Geno Smith in like the 18th round, be my guest. I think that's totally fine.
Yeah. By the way, it's interesting that the 20-round RotoWire Online Championship draft I did Saturday, so many quarterbacks went undrafted. Watson, Mayfield, Fields, Levis, Bo Nix, Bryce Young,
Yeah.
All went undrafted. Geno did get drafted, which is also interesting, but makes me kind of wish I didn't draft a backup there. There was plenty of them available to pick up. I think that's the real takeaway for me there, is maybe even use the waiver wire on some of these quarterbacks I may or may not like. Over under on the Seattle Seahawks is at 7.5 wins. I know you're optimistic about them. I am too. I think this is an easy over for us, right?
It's an easy over for me. Yeah. Like I said, I'm kind of fading the Arizona Cardinals in that division. I think again, this could be a 3 playoff team division if they don't beat up on each other too much in division. And I like the start here for Seattle as well. I mean, you're getting Bo Nix in his first NFL start at home in week 1. You talk about another sneaky survivor spot. I think that could be one. They go to the Patriots in week 2. I think you have a really good chance to get off on the right foot, start this season 2-0. You do get Miami in week 3, but that one's on the road in Seattle. Certainly better than going down to Miami in September. Does pick up a little bit after that. You got to go to Detroit. You get the 49ers for the first time in week 6, but you get the Giants at home in week 5. You get the Bills at home. They do have to go to the Jets, but they get the Packers at home. Like a lot of their more difficult games outside of the divisional rotation do come in Seattle. So I don't think the Seahawks have as high of a ceiling to me as the Rams do, and obviously not the same kind of ceiling as the 49ers. But if you're telling me that the win total 7.5, I think this team could get to 9.
Yeah, I think they're a very sneaky team defense for fantasy also.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned the schedule, those first 2 weeks. I did the weight on defense thing, and you get those 2 games where you can start them the first 2 weeks, and then you can kind of go from there. Mike McDonald's a defensive wizard. You look at the halftime adjustments in that Houston-Baltimore playoff game. They just utterly shut down the Texans in the second half of that game. I think Baltimore is going to miss him, by the way. I think they're going to miss McDonald quite a bit. And other assistants as well. It wasn't just McDonald that they lost too. So I think that is also noteworthy a little bit there to pay attention to.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, Seattle was 30th in defensive EPA last year. I mean, this was not a good defense by any means. And I think there's a reason that they made that specific hire, grabbing McDonald from Baltimore. And I agree with you, by the way. I mean, it's one of the curses of being a successful franchise is that brain drain that you suffer on your coaching staff.
Yeah, you need that continuity. It's very difficult to maintain unless you just really pay up. But everybody wants to be their own man at some point in time. So I get it too. All right, that's going to wrap up the NFC West for us. Thanks for spending a couple hours with us today. NFC South, NFC West. Really appreciate all the people that are jumping in the comments in the live stream. And of course, those of you listening on the podcast as well, please like, rate, and review the podcast for us. We do really, truly appreciate there. And you can hit that notification button there, let you know anytime a RotoWire podcast comes up. And finally, check out rotowire.com/pod. Got Joe and Jake tomorrow. Thanks for listening to RotoWire. Take care.